Wait. You're keeping me? The alien princess had no idea what she just agreed to. He's caught mid-breath, blood pounding in his ears, and she stands only a few paces away, bound at the wrists but every inch of her posture threatening. The chamber's dim lights cast flickering shadows across the metallic walls, and in those first few silent seconds, he registers the gleam of her golden eyes as they dart to assess him, tall, broad shoulders rigid beneath battered armor, streaks of dried plasma scoring the plates. Her slender form is deceptively delicate, though cords of muscle shift beneath her shimmering skin, which bears swirling pale blue markings that pulse faintly with her every heartbeat. A steel collar clamps around her elegant neck, an unfamiliar device flickering with caution lights, but she doesn't so much as flinch at its presence. Instead, she tilts her head, letting a curtain of dark, lustrous hair fall over a cheekbone etched with a faint scar. For a moment, neither of them speaks, tension tightening the stale air as his hands flex near the sidearm strapped low on his hip. Then she shifts her weight, one step forward despite the shackles, and the corners of her lips twitch in a hint of mocking amusement. Unchain me, or I'll carve that smug sneer off your face. A single heartbeat passes in which he doesn't answer, only narrows his cold gray eyes, jaw tightening in silent challenge. Then his lips pull into the faintest smirk, a response that nearly matches hers in its arrogant composure. He steps forward, boots echoing on the grated floor, letting the overhead lamp cast a harsh line across his scarred cheek. He is Lucian, a soldier hardened by countless brutal campaigns against her people, and though he's known for an unwavering stoicism in the face of danger, something about this alien princess stirs a dangerous energy beneath his skin. An extra jolt of adrenaline. Maybe it's the mesmerizing glow of her tattoos, pulsing faintly in tune with her heartbeat, or the subtle hum of her presence that seems to vibrate through the cramped cell. She is Syra, princess of a militant alien empire that has ravaged entire systems, including the one he once called home. He has every reason to loathe her, yet here she stands, shackled and yet unbroken, issuing threats as though her predicament is a minor inconvenience. He doesn't bother explaining himself or offering any polite conversation. There's no time. Outside this reinforced chamber, alarm klaxons wail, half the facility is ablaze, and the rest swarms with her Imperial Guard. He'd caught her in the chaos, one well-timed explosive charge scattering her entourage. Now, forced to keep her alive for reasons he refuses to acknowledge, perhaps vengeance, perhaps leverage, he must decide if she's more valuable as a prisoner or as a partner. He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes when he stunned her, recognized the moment she realized that among the enemy humans, someone dared to lay hands on royalty. Yet she's here, bound by reinforced cuffs, that collar designed to dampen whatever formidable powers her species wields. And still, she's threatening him, taunting him. He might admire it if he weren't so damned furious. He draws a breath and finally speaks, letting his voice resonate with the same lethal calm she exudes. That collar is rigged to deliver a shock that'd fry half your nervous system, princess. You make one move to harm me, and I'll press the button. She stares at him for a long moment, the faint glow of her markings intensifying, and a subtle crackle of energy dances over her forearms. His threat doesn't cow her. Instead, she lifts her chin, a regal movement that manages to look haughty even with her hair half in her eyes. A chain rattles as she tests the bond, then shrugs as if bored. Pathetic. She spits, swaying her hips closer. Your technology can barely contain my power. You're too weak to break me, human. I can feel your pulse racing. Her voice vibrates with an uncanny resonance that seems to settle somewhere between his ears, sending an involuntary shiver down his spine. But he doesn't let it show in his expression. His face remains the same impassive mask he's worn on every battlefield, though inside, something clenches in his chest. He's taken alien prisoners before, but none like her, the princess, rumored to have inherited abilities that could scorch a planet's surface. The device on her neck may be only a temporary solution. Move! He snaps, gesturing with his sidearm. Outside, a corridor flickers in and out of emergency lighting, smoke drifting from distant fires. She hesitates, eyes flicking toward the door, then back to him. I can walk, she says. But when we leave this place, you'll regret not killing me in that explosion. He steps close, intentionally invading her space, his imposing height forcing her to tilt her head to meet his eyes. The tension crackles like the air before a storm. I'm not letting you die just yet, he growls. And when I keep you, you better believe it's for a purpose. He clenches a hand around the chain linking her cuffs, and she tenses. She doesn't flinch, not even when his grip tightens enough that the metal digs into her wrists. If anything, her expression grows sharper, more feral. Wait, she says, voice cold as midnight. You're keeping me? His smirk deepens. Did I stutter? For a moment, pure rage dances in her eyes, but behind it, there's a calculating gleam. She's a princess, after all, she'll assess her options. If he's truly planning to drag her through the corridors of this crumbling outpost, she might find an opening, a chance to either kill him or bend him to her will. He senses that calculation, and in response, he yanks the chain and forces her to step in line behind him. The brush of her slender body against his side is electric, a jarring jolt that he can't afford to dwell on. Not now. More pressing is the fact that the entire station is compromised, and soon enough, reinforcements will arrive. He needs to get off-world, with or without her. She resists for half a step, testing his strength. He notices how her bare arms, slender but sculpted, flex as she tries to wrench free. The swirling tattoos brighten in color, luminous lines that trace from her fingertips up along her biceps, hinting at the power surging within. She's no fragile trophy, she's a weapon in her own right. He'd be a fool to underestimate her, and he's not about to repeat the mistakes so many other humans did when they engaged her father's empire. Still, there's no time for fear. He can practically smell the heat of her adrenaline, or perhaps that's her alien physiology releasing some pheromonal wave. Either way, he clamps down on any reaction and presses forward. A pair of security doors slide open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing flickering lights overhead. The corridor beyond is lined with destroyed mechanical turrets, half submerged in acrid smoke. He stays alert, scanning corners. She might attempt an escape the moment he's distracted. Better to keep her in front of him, but he can't risk giving her his back. His free hand tightens around his sidearm. He can feel her tension, like a coiled serpent ready to strike at the first sign of weakness. They proceed in a tense silence, the only sounds the clang of their boots on the grated floor, the distant explosions rumbling through the base, and her intermittent harsh breaths whenever he tugs on the chain a little harder than necessary. When they reach an intersection, a sudden burst of gunfire rips through the corridor. Lucian drops to a knee, hauling her down with him. She hisses at his roughness, but doesn't protest further as red-hot plasma bolts slam into the metal walls. Pieces of shrapnel spark around them. The collar around her neck flashes brighter in warning, and she clenches her jaw. He senses she might want to channel her abilities, but the device must be limiting her, for she doesn't unleash a single flicker of power. Instead, she gives him a withering stare. He risks a quick glance around the corner, spots a squad of her father's elite troopers. The irony isn't lost on him. He's using her as a hostage, but they might not care. They'd kill him if they had the chance, and possibly kill her to prevent capture. A princess, after all, is just as dangerous if turned against them. She spits out a curse in her own language, a harsh guttural sound that resonates strangely through the corridor. Her gaze flicks between him, his weapon, and the scattered crates behind which they could take cover. "Let me go," she growls under her breath, "and I'll take them down." He almost laughs at the suggestion. "Nice try, princess." Another volley of plasma streaks by, forcing them back. She bares her teeth in frustration. "You can't fight them alone," she snaps. "And I don't plan to die here." Despite himself, he can't help the faint thrill that runs through him at her words. She's right, he won't make it out of here easily. The only advantage he has is her presence. Maybe they could force these guards to hesitate just long enough for him to slip away. Yet the corridor is narrow, and the troopers will breach soon. If they're pinned here, they're both as good as dead. He curses under his breath. "We work together, or either of us leaves this place." You so much as twitch in the wrong direction, I'll drop you. Understand? She gives him an arch look, then nods once. It's not agreement. He can see the hatred smoldering in those golden eyes, but it's a temporary truce. Maybe that's all he can ask for. Quickly, he unhooks the chain from her cuffs, though she remains shackled, and deactivates the collar's shock function but not its suppression field. She hisses at the diminishing hum, like a creature testing the edges of a cage. Don't get any ideas, he warns, then he signals for her to move behind a crate. She slides gracefully into position, nimble despite her restraints, and he notices how her movements stir a warmth in his gut. Irritation flickers at the realization. He shouldn't be noticing her fluid grace or the faint shimmer of her skin in the flickering lights. He should be focused on survival. He clenches his jaw and steadies his sidearm. The troopers fan out, methodical in their approach, evidently trained to corner their prey. She looks at him sideways, a silent question in her gaze. Are we going to fight or run? He shakes his head. Their only chance is to cause a distraction big enough to slip past. She reads his intention without words and holds up one hand. The collar suppresses her more destructive abilities, but she conjures something small, a flickering spark of energy between her fingers. He narrows his eyes in caution but doesn't stop her. If she tries to blast him, she'll regret it, but if she can conjure a flash or burst to distract the troopers, it might be their only chance. She strikes. A searing flash of light ricochets off the walls, forcing the troopers to recoil. Lucian uses that split-second advantage to open fire, picking off two of them with precise shots. She lunges forward, leading with a savage kick. The chain at her wrist hamstrings her movements, but she's still a whirlwind of lethal grace, knocking an armed guard off balance. Blood pounds in Lucian's ears as chaos erupts. Amid the frantic struggle, he can't help noticing her proximity, the surge of her body, the heat that radiates off her in waves. It's an unwelcome distraction, but he uses it, harnessing the heightened adrenaline to keep his aim steady. Soon, the corridor falls silent save for the crackle of fires and the hiss of overheated electronics. Four troopers lie crumpled on the floor. She's breathing heavily, her shoulders rising and falling in quick succession. He snatches her chain before she can spin away, yanking her back toward him. We're leaving, he says. Now. She's still furious, but the immediate danger forces her to comply. Together, they hurry toward the docking bay, stepping over debris and twisted metal. His mind reels from the close-quarters fight, the fact that she fought beside him, if only for a minute, and the unsettling realization that with every shared heartbeat, their synergy made them devastating. It's a notion he banishes immediately. He won't let the memory of his raised homeworld slip away, nor can he forget that she's the heir to the empire responsible for that destruction. When they reach the final blast door to the docking bay, it's jammed. Smoke leaks from the edges, and the console flickers with red error messages in an alien script. She stares at the broken panel and sneers. Open it, she demands, as though she expects him to solve every obstacle at her whim. He grunts in frustration, scanning for an override. We might have to blow it, he says, patting the satchel at his waist. He's got a few charges left, and the station is already compromised. You do that, she warns, and you might bring half the ceiling down on us. She reaches forward with an almost lazy confidence, placing her hand on the console. The collar hums, resisting her attempts to override the panel with her innate ability, but she grits her teeth, forcing a faint glow from her fingertips. He's about to snap at her to stop. Then with a violent spark, the door groans and grinds open a few feet. They slip through the gap, stepping into the hangar. Rows of scorched ships line the bay, some half ruined from the fighting. Alarms continue to blare. He sees a small craft that looks operational. She sees it too, eyes narrowing. That piece of junk? If we even get it running, it'll take a miracle to break orbit. He ignores her condescension, scanning for more hostiles. The coast is clear for now. He can't resist a sarcastic edge to his tone. Well, unless you've got a better idea, princess? She juts her chin forward defiantly but doesn't argue. Time is short. She follows him to the craft, though her shackles impede her climb up the short ramp. He watches her struggle for a brief moment, then grunts and hauls her aboard. She bristles at the indignity, cheeks flushing a darker shade. Inside the cramped cockpit, he straps himself into the pilot's chair. She slides into the seat beside him, shackled hands gripping the console. She glances at him, an expression of mild disgust. "I don't even want to imagine how you humans operate these relics." He hits a series of switches, and the engine coughs to life, sputtering as if about to die. A second attempt, and it roars with grudging intensity. He glances sideways at her. "Keep quiet if you want to get out of here alive." She bristles, but says nothing. The docking bay doors creak open with a shriek of twisting metal, the bay's force field shimmering in the smoky haze. Then they tear off into the void, the small craft rattling violently as it clears the station. Behind them, distant explosions ripple across the structure's surface, sending chunks of glowing debris scattering. She leans forward to stare through the viewport. Her parted lips reveal sharpened canines, an evolutionary hallmark of her species. Golden eyes flick briefly toward the monstrous capital ships circling in orbit, each bearing the emblem of her empire. Fear might flicker for a split second, but she hides it well behind cold determination. He angles the craft in a steep arc, scanning for a slip in their formation. "They're waiting for us," she murmurs. "They'll shoot us down." He doesn't reply. He's wrestling the controls, adrenaline thrashing in his veins. If they don't exit the planet's gravity well quickly, they'll be an easy target. On the next pass, he slams the boosters. The hull vibrates alarmingly, but they lurch forward, outrunning a barrage of green energy bolts that slice through the void. When the chaos subsides to a distant shimmer behind them, he exhales. She tears her gaze from the viewport to him, her lip curling. "You truly are insane." He meets her glare with one of his own. "It worked, didn't it? We're alive." She doesn't refute him. Instead, she flexes her bound wrists, gaze flicking to the collar. "You realize this is temporary," she says softly, though the threat pulses in every word. "I'll figure out how to break these constraints, and you'll regret chaining me." He flicks a switch, setting the autopilot for a set of coordinates in uncharted territory, away from both the Empire's main fleet and any human-controlled outposts. "Maybe," he replies in a tone that suggests he's not so sure. "But if you'd rather I leave you drifting in a pod, alone, say the word." She doesn't speak, merely stares at him with open hostility that doesn't quite mask the slightest hint of reluctant intrigue. The tension between them thickens with each passing breath, the forced proximity of the cockpit offering no respite. There is no gentleness in the air, no comforting lull after the violence, only a simmering sense that they're not finished. They can't be. He notices the faint sheen of sweat at her temple, wonders if it's just the residual heat of battle or something more. She's far from harmless despite her restraints, and he'd be a fool to lower his guard. Yet his gaze lingers on the curve of her neck, the subtle luminescence traveling across her collarbone. She must sense it because her eyes narrow dangerously, as if to say, "Keep staring, and I'll tear you apart." That single exchange is enough to snap him back to reality. He breaks the stare first, checking the NAV data as the ship hums, pushing deeper into the black. He rummages in a storage compartment, retrieving supplies, water packs, a med kit, a few rations. Tossing her a water pack, he waits to see if she'll drink or throw it at his face. She snatches it, tears it open with her teeth, and gulps it down. He can see her swallow with desperate need, though she tries to conceal it. The corners of his mouth twitch in what might be amusement, but he says nothing. Then, with purposeful calm, he begins checking his weapons. He glances over to find her watching him. Her unwavering stare is unsettling, like a predator cataloging weaknesses. His heart drums faster, but outwardly, he remains stone-faced. "I won't starve you or torture you," he says curtly, as though that's all the explanation he owes. She arches a brow. "How princely of you," she mocks, clenching her shackled wrists. "Let's not pretend you're doing this out of mercy." He meets her gaze without blinking. "I'm doing it because I need leverage against your father. You, princess, are the best bargaining chip in the galaxy." Her features twist in anger. You think my father will grovel for my return? He'd sooner scald an entire planet than bend to a human. Lucian shrugs. Then maybe I'll use you for something else. Trade you, force your empire to withdraw from certain sectors, or… He lets the implication hang in the air. Kill you. She bares her teeth, but a spark of uncertainty flickers in her eyes. She's beginning to grasp that he might not follow the typical script of her captors. A tense quiet settles in the cockpit, broken only by the hum of the engines. She flexes her hands again, the cuffs rattling. You will remove these, she orders, as though commanding a subordinate. He moves closer, leaning in until he's nearly nose to nose with her. She doesn't flinch, maintaining her composure despite the sudden proximity. I'll remove them when I know you won't use your powers to fry my skull, he says in a low voice. She can feel the heat rolling off him, that savage energy just beneath his skin. She glances down at his lips for the briefest second, then back up, eyes glittering. Fine. Keep them on me, she says with a sneer. But don't be surprised when I slip them off behind your back. He doesn't rise to the bait, instead shifting away to check the NAV computer. They have hours to travel yet. Time enough to plan their next move, and time enough for tempers to erupt again. She leans back in her seat, tilts her head, and regards him with a sharper edge. Lucian, she says, rolling his name on her tongue as if tasting it for poison. He stiffens. She must have pieced it together from stolen intelligence, or from the insignia he wears, battered though it is. That's right, he grunts. So you know who I am? She nods slowly. My father had a file on you, something about a human soldier who nearly assassinated him on Cartho's moon. You lost, but left him with a scar. The corners of her lips twitch in what might be admiration or condescension. You're either desperate or foolish. Probably both. He acknowledges none of that, though his mind surges with old memories. He sets his jaw, determined not to let her unravel him. Without warning, the ship's console beeps an alarm. He curses under his breath, scanning for the cause. We've got a tail, he mutters, spotting a small blip approaching fast. Could be a scout from her empire. She sits up straighter, the tension returning in full force. Move, she snaps. Lose them. He whirls on her with a scowl. I don't take orders from you. She scowls back but says nothing, too aware of the threat on the scanners. He punches the throttle, pushing the engine to near overload. The hull rattles in protest, but they surge ahead into an asteroid field. She grips the console, eyes narrowing as the ship weaves through the tumbling rocks. They race through the void, chased by a persistent pursuer that fires intermittent shots, each shot jolting the small craft as it schemes past. She breathes unevenly, the collar glowing faintly, perhaps from her frustration at being unable to unleash her full potential. Lucian handles the controls with practiced precision, though sweat beads at his brow. They're dangerously close to colliding with asteroids the size of battlecruisers. One wrong move, and they're dust. Hold on, he growls. She swallows a retort, adrenaline pumping fresh through her veins. The next volley of plasma scorches the left engine, and alarms blare in the cockpit. He curses, jerking the ship violently to one side. She nearly slams against the bulkhead, but recovers, and through gritted teeth, she hisses. You call this flying? He fires a shot from the rear cannons, the jolt reverberating through the cabin. The pursuer barrel rolls around the asteroid, still on their tail. A second shot, closer this time. Sparks fly from a console behind them. An acrid smell fills the cockpit. If you've got any bright ideas, he says between clenched teeth, now's the time. She tries once more to channel her energy, pressing shackled hands to the collar in hopes of shorting it out. The device crackles, but remains intact. The best she can manage is a flicker of static that disrupts one of the enemy's targeting sensors momentarily. Still, it's enough for Lucian to angle the ship behind a massive drifting rock, break line of sight, and dive into a hidden canyon of swirling debris. For a moment, the radar goes blank. The pursuer overshoots their position. He exudes a half-sighed breath of relief. She doesn't thank him or express any gratitude, It's not in her nature. Instead, she glares at him with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect. "We're alive," she mutters. He doesn't reply, guiding the craft deeper into the asteroid field, searching for a safe location to hide or patch up the ship. His muscles ache from the tension, and his mind reels from the high-intensity standoff. The smell of ozone lingers in the air, mixing with both of their rapid breathing. He can sense her presence more acutely than before, every breath she takes as if it's amplified in the still cabin. He wonders if it's an effect of her physiology, or his own heightened awareness. Either way, the realization unsettles him. They drift into a quiet pocket of the field. He kills the engines, letting them coast in the lee of a cluster of rocks. For a brief moment, it's silent except for the ping of cooling metal. He undoes his harness, and she follows suit, though her cuffs still restrict much of her movement. The quiet tension returns, coiling in the dimly lit space of the cockpit. "We can't stay here forever," she eventually says, her tone more measured. "You know my Empire's reach. They'll find us eventually." He nods, reining in his frustration. "I just need time to plan our next jump. Then we can vanish beyond the known gates. Your father's empire doesn't hold everything," she snorts. "You underestimate the Emperor. My father's network of informants stretches across galaxies." She's right, of course, but he can't let that deter him. Slowly, he rises and moves to the small corridor beyond the cockpit. She stands too, shackles clinking as she follows him. The hallway is cramped, barely room for them both, forcing them into near-constant contact. He's acutely aware of her heat, the smoothness of her skin when her arm brushes his. He finds a supply locker, rummaging for a patch kit to fix the scorched engine. She hovers behind him, silent as a wraith. When he glances at her from the corner of his eye, she's watching him so intently he can feel the burn of her gaze. She's a captive, but everything about her posture radiates sovereignty, as though this is merely a temporary setback. For a moment, he wonders if he's made a colossal mistake bringing her aboard. She might just be the end of him if he's not careful. Then again, if anyone can help him bring down the Empire from within, or at least secure a bargain, it's her. In a quiet but firm voice, he says, "You're going to help me sabotage your father's next campaign." She arches an elegant brow. "And why would I do that?" He shuts the locker and turns to face her, bracing one arm on the wall. She stands her ground, unflinching, even though he towers over her. "Because your people took everything from me. Because you're stuck with me for now, unless you fancy floating in space." She narrows her eyes, but there's a hint of something there, maybe curiosity. "You think you can force me to betray my own blood?" He leans in, ignoring the sudden closeness. Her breath is warm on his face, and that subtle, seductive hum in her voice stirs him in a way that sets his teeth on edge. "You want to live, don't you?" he replies softly. "And maybe, just maybe, there's a part of you that doesn't agree with every atrocity your father commits." She meets his gaze, unblinking, silent. There's a crackle in the air, like the barest flicker of lightning before a storm. Then, with deliberate slowness, she lifts her shackled wrists and presses them against his chest, pushing him back a step. He doesn't resist, though the contact sends a jolt through his body, a surge of heightened awareness. She's warm, too warm for a normal human range, and it triggers a primal response somewhere in the back of his mind. He tries to ignore it, clamping down on the flutter in his stomach. They stand there, chest to chest, the moment stretched taut, until she lowers her hands. "If you want my cooperation," she says, voice low and lethal, "earn it." He exhales, tension knotting in his shoulders. "Fine. First, we fix the engine. Then we plan our next move. If you try anything, I won't hesitate." She cracks a grin that doesn't reach her eyes. "Nor will I." With that, he strides back toward the cockpit, patch kit in hand. She follows, and the path is so narrow that their bodies brush again. This time, he notices how his pulse jumps. He detests the instinctive response, but he can't pretend it isn't there. She feels it too, perhaps, because her lips curl in that faint, dangerous smile. It's a fleeting expression that promises the lines between hate and something else might blur if circumstances forced them close enough. She drops into the co-pilot's seat while he steps into the small maintenance bay to access the engine. Sparks erupt as he pries open a scorched panel. He mutters a curse, fumbling with wires. Her voice filters through the open door. Is that normal? He peers out, sees her indicating the cockpit readout. No, he calls back. Looks like a coolant leak in the stabilizers. She watches him work, shackled hands resting on her knees. A wisp of smoke drifts past her face, and for the first time, she looks mildly concerned. This ship might blow up before you can exploit your precious bargaining chip, she says. He grimaces. Then I guess you'd better hope I'm good at my job. Minutes tick by in uneasy quiet, punctuated by the hiss of tools and the clang of metal. At one point, she steps in behind him, looking over his shoulder at the tangled mass of cables. Her proximity stirs something in him again, a heightened sense of awareness he can't smother. He can smell the faint, exotic scent that clings to her, something like ozone and night-blooming flowers. He focuses on the task at hand, ignoring the distraction. She seems to delight in his tension, though she maintains that regal indifference on her face. Eventually, he splices a series of cables, bypassing the damaged couplings. The engines sputter, then roar to half power, enough to keep them stable. He releases a breath. That'll do, he says, stepping back. She arches an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed, but says nothing. He gestures for her to return to the cockpit. Once settled in their seats again, he initiates a slow maneuver through the asteroid field. The scanners remain clear. For now, they have a brief lull. Neither of them is used to letting their guard down, so the tension remains a third presence in the cramped space. She crosses her shackled wrists, posture rigid, and fixes him with a piercing stare. You're not just a soldier, she says at length, in a tone that suggests she's been mulling it over. You have personal reasons for risking everything to capture me. What happened on your world? He doesn't answer for several seconds, calibrating the NAV computer with forced focus. She presses, voice a silky whisper. Your face betrays a bitterness beyond mere duty. Tell me. He flicks a glance her way, jaw clenched. You want my story? He laughs without humor. If I tell you, you'll think me weak. She cocks her head, feigning curiosity. Try me. He inhales sharply. Your empire came to my colony when I was just a recruit. We tried to fight back, but your father's warships leveled our cities. My family died in the rubble. I found their bodies beneath the smoking ruins. I vowed then that I'd do whatever it takes to bring your empire to its knees. She listens without visible sympathy, but something in her gaze flickers. I see, she says simply, no apology or pity in her tone. You want revenge. He doesn't respond, but his silence is enough. She's got the picture. With a final beep, the autopilot sets their course. He turns to her. Now it's my turn to ask a question, he says quietly. Why did you agree to go with me? Why not fight to the death back there? She's silent for a moment, her features unreadable. Then, because if I died, my father would have one less pawn to worry about. At least if I live, there's a chance I can reclaim what's mine. He narrows his eyes, parsing her words. What exactly is yours? She just smiles, a cold, feral expression, and that's answer enough for now. They drift like that for a time, locked in a standoff of wills neither is willing to lose. The forced proximity, the echoing tension of battle, the knowledge that they need each other to survive, everything builds an undercurrent that feels like a loaded weapon ready to fire. Every sentence they exchange might as well be a threat or a challenge. Every sidelong glance is a test. Still, they remain side by side, a precarious alliance driven by necessity, each unwilling to cede ground. The ship hums in the background, carrying them into the unknown, and neither can fully guess what lies ahead. But one thing becomes clear to both: no matter how violently they clash, either can deny that the other stirs something in the blood, something that might be as destructive as it is magnetic. By the time they break free of the asteroid field and set course for the uncharted rim, an uneasy truce settles between them. It isn't comfortable or pleasant. It's the kind of tension that ties them in knots, full of potential betrayal at any second. Yet underneath that, something else smolders, unacknowledged but impossible to ignore. They can each feel it in the smallest brush of an arm, the faint hitch in breath whenever the silence grows too thick. And though they both fight to maintain composure, somewhere deep inside, each wonders if the line between hatred and desire is far thinner than they'd ever imagined. They haven't slept in nearly a day, but both refuse to show weakness. The small craft's autopilot beeps occasionally, adjusting course, leaving them to endure each other's company. Lucian scrolls through navigation readouts while Syra, shackled wrists resting on her lap, observes him with a detached gaze that occasionally flickers with undisguised suspicion. He can feel her stare like a brand on his back, an unrelenting reminder that she is not merely a captive but a lethal threat. Every so often, he notices the glow of her markings intensify or fade, correlating with her mood or level of agitation. He wonders whether those luminous patterns are tied to her biology or her emotional state. He can't ask, not when every question might expose more of his own vulnerabilities. At some point, she attempts to shift the conversation. "Where are you taking me?" He spares her a glance. "Somewhere off the charts. You might have the entire empire at your beck and call, but there are corners of the galaxy they don't control yet." She rolls her eyes. "So you'll hide in the shadows like a rat?" He snorts. "I'll do whatever it takes to survive, and keep you from rejoining your father. If that means crawling through shadows, so be it." She leans back, letting a disdainful silence hang for a moment. Brave words for a man who's cowering outside civilized space. He grips the controls harder, knuckles widening. "There is nothing civilized about your empire." He fires back. "And I'm not cowering. I'm waiting for an opportunity to strike." Her lips part with a retort on the tip of her tongue, but the NAV console suddenly flares red. Proximity alert. Something's coming out of warp. He mutters a curse, flicking switches to get a reading. Another ship. Bigger. Possibly a cruiser. His jaw sets. "We're not out of trouble yet." She peers over his shoulder. "It's not Imperial," she says, squinting at the readouts. "No transponder codes match." The tension in his shoulders eases a fraction. "Pirates, maybe? Or mercenaries." She smirks. "Whoever they are, they might give us trouble if we linger." He punches the engines, hoping to avoid detection, but the sensor pings show the unknown vessel turning in their direction. "Looks like they've already spotted us," he mutters. She remains silent as he angles the craft away, scanning for the next system jump. He sets coordinates for a nearby star cluster, but the drives need time to recharge. The unknown vessel closes in. Adrenaline pricks the back of his neck. He can't handle another firefight with the ship in this condition. He checks the scanner, sees the approach vector. Then, with an abrupt beep, the ship comms crackle, a distorted voice hacking through the static. "Unidentified vessel, heave to and prepare for boarding, or we'll blow you to pieces." Syra rolls her eyes. "Charming," she mutters. Lucian toggles the transmitter voice flat. "We're just passing through. No cargo worth taking." The response is immediate, laced with sadistic amusement. "Sure you don't. Cut engines or we'll test your hull's integrity." He curses under his breath. Syra shifts in her seat, a predatory gleam lighting her eyes. "This might be your chance," she says softly. "Release me. Let me handle them." He scoffs, ignoring the traitorous spark of excitement that runs through him at the prospect of seeing her unleashed. "Not a chance," he growls, but he can't deny the logic. They're outgunned. If she uses her abilities, maybe she can blast them free. But that means removing the collar or at least disabling part of it. He clenches the controls, grappling with the risk. Before he can decide, the pirates open fire, grazing their flank. The ship jolts violently, sending sparks showering from an overhead panel. "Damn it!" he snarls, wrestling to keep them steady. Syra's eyes lock onto him, expression fierce. "Make up your mind, human. Either let me help or prepare to die out here." Another blast rocks the ship. He grits his teeth, reaching beneath the console to pull a small override switch for the collar. He hesitates for a single heartbeat, meeting her gaze. If you double-cross me, she cuts him off. I know. You'll kill me. Now do it. He flips the switch, and the collar's lights dim, the field dampening her powers flickering out. The shackles remain, but she arches her neck, luminous tattoos flaring bright. The raw energy in the cockpit intensifies, as though the air itself is charged with static. A predatory smile curves her lips. Get me close enough, and I'll give them a taste of real power. With no other choice, Lucian guns the engines, ignoring the shrill protest from the battered thrusters. The pirate vessel looms large, bristling with turrets. A tractor beam flickers, trying to lock on. He weaves around it, a near impossible maneuver. Syra closes her eyes, summoning a swirling vortex of light around her hands, the shackles rattling but no longer containing her power. The air in the cockpit crackles. She's pushing her ability to its limits in these cramped quarters. The collar might still be restricting her from unleashing cataclysmic force, but she can muster enough for a serious strike. Keep them in my line of sight, she hisses, voice thick with concentration. He adjusts the heading, bringing the pirate cruiser into full view. She lifts her bound hands, and arcs of electricity leap from her fingertips, dancing across the control console and then projecting outward through the forward cannons. A brilliant lance of energy spears the darkness, slamming into the pirate vessel's shield generator. The resulting explosion sends shockwaves rippling through space. Their shields are down! Lucian shouts, eyes widening in disbelief at the destructive capacity she's just demonstrated. Syra exhales, visibly exhausted, but not done yet. She channels another surge, smaller this time, focusing on their weapon systems. A second flare, and the pirate cruiser's main turret erupts in a shower of debris. Furious comm chatter crackles over the comm, but it's too garbled to parse. Lucian seizes the moment, pushing the throttle to max, racing past the crippled cruiser. A few potshots streak by, but the pirates are in disarray, their targeting array fried. He can almost taste their panic. In the cockpit, Syra slumps back, sweat beading her brow, the glow around her dimming. The collar crackles to life again, automatically reasserting some measure of control after her power spike. She winces as a jolt courses through the device, punishing her for pushing past its limits. Lucian risks a glance, uncertain if he should feel grateful or terrified by her display. Probably both. She breathes heavily, eyes half-lidded, but the triumphant curl of her lips remains. Now you see, she says softly, the Empire's power isn't limited to technology alone. We are born with it. He swallows, returning his focus to navigation. Noted, he says coolly, though the adrenaline swirling in his veins betrays a more complicated reaction. They leave the pirates behind, drifting disabled in open space. Once they're far enough, Lucian lets out a breath, heart still thundering. Syra remains silent, letting her shoulders sag in the seat. If she expects thanks, she doesn't show it, and he doesn't offer it. Instead, he re-engages the autopilot and stands, gripping the back of her seat. You okay? He asks, the question more abrupt than gentle. She side-eyes him, hair damp at the temples. I'll live. A mutual understanding passes between them. They needed each other back there. Without her, he'd be dead. Without him, she'd still be trapped on that station, or gunned down by her own father's troopers. A strange synergy, like combative partners who can't stand each other yet fight flawlessly side by side. The tension that crackles between them is no longer purely hatred, there's something else. In a moment of exhaustion, she closes her eyes, breathing ragged. His gaze drifts to the collar, noticing how the faint burn marks around the edges mar her otherwise perfect skin. Something twists uncomfortably in his gut. He didn't put the device on her, someone else did, some human scientist or soldier more ruthless than him, but he's keeping her in it. A momentary pang of conscience. He quickly buries it. She's the princess of an enemy empire, a lethal threat. He can't afford to feel pity or anything resembling empathy. Still, the moment lingers, the hum of the engines filling the silence. She slowly opens her eyes, catching him looking. The corners of her mouth tilt in that half-smile that never quite reaches her eyes. "What?" she demands. He shakes his head. "Nothing." They remain like that, close enough to feel each other's body heat, and in that suffocating stillness, the spark of attraction grows harder to ignore. The inescapable awareness of how her body, glowing with residual power, seems to pull at him on some primal level. He forcibly turns away, clearing his throat. "We've got a few hours before we reach the next point. Get some rest if you want." She laughs, a short, mocking sound. "Rest? With these chains?" He glances down at her shackles, and despite himself, a part of him wants to unlock them. But he doesn't. Instead, he mutters, "Your problem, not mine," and steps into the back compartment, leaving her alone in the cockpit. It's an abrupt retreat, but it's the only way he can keep his composure. He settles on a narrow bench in the back, letting his head fall against the bulkhead. The faint hum of the ship's systems and the quiet swirl of residual adrenaline makes sleep elusive. His mind wanders back to Syra, how she looked channeling her power, terrifying and mesmerizing. He reminds himself that she's an enemy, a captive, that he has a personal vendetta that must be exacted. Yet that doesn't stop the swirl of conflicting emotions threatening to crack his hardened exterior. He closes his eyes, trying to quell the storm inside. Elsewhere in the ship, Syra struggles with her restraints, cursing under her breath. She's bruised, exhausted, her own adrenaline high crashing. But in the aftermath of that battle with the pirates, she's left with a relentless ache in her bones, and a persistent, confounding awareness of the human who holds her chains. She loathes him, his arrogance, his refusal to bow to her station. Yet part of her can't deny the thrill she felt when they fought side by side, the synergy of their combined aggression. She tries to dismiss it as a necessary evil, but the memory lingers, fueling an unsettling curiosity. With a sigh, she slumps back in the seat and closes her eyes, letting the engine's vibrations lull her into a restless doze. The hours pass in a restless haze. Eventually, the NAV computer chimes, pulling them both from the edges of uneasy sleep. Lucian returns to the cockpit. Syra is already awake, dark circles under her eyes but posture upright and imposing. The raw tension between them greets him like a physical force. Wordlessly, he slips into the pilot's chair. She raises her brows. "Where to now?" He sets a new course. "A frontier station. They're neutral, more or less, and they don't ask questions if you pay enough." She frowns. "You're bringing me into a public space? Not very wise." He shrugs, flipping switches. "We need a better ship, supplies, and a place to lay low." "Unless you can conjure everything we need out of thin air?" She doesn't answer, but he can sense her doubt. Soon, the small craft emerges from FTL on the outskirts of a desolate star system dotted with abandoned mines and rickety outposts. In the distance, a small station orbits a dying planet. Lucian angles the ship toward it, ignoring the tremor of nerves in his gut. He's well known among human rebels and insurgents, but beyond the Empire's official territory, the lines between friend and foe blur. As they approach, the station's comms crackle with automated docking instructions. He responds, feeding them false transponder data. At least the system is so far off the main routes that few will ask questions. The docking clamps engage with a heavy clang, and they power down the engines. A wave of stale recirculated air greets them as the hatch opens. At the threshold, he turns to Syra, hooking a lead to her chain. Her eyes blaze with fury at the indignity. He meets her glare with stoic resolve. "Remember," he says quietly, "you try to run, or you try to blow my head off, I'll detonate that collar." She bares her teeth but says nothing. The mention of the collar reminds her that she's no freer now than she was in the Empire's custody. Together, they step onto the station's battered deck plating. The corridors are dim, lit by flickering fluorescent strips. They pass half a dozen shady characters, humans, aliens of various species, all eyeing them with curiosity or hostility. Syra's exotic appearance draws stares, but none dare approach when they see Lucian's hand gripping the chain. At a rundown merchant's kiosk, Lucian inquires about his ship. The vendor, a short, wiry man with an augmented eye, glances suspiciously at Syra, noting her regal bearing and the collar. Lucian remains tight-lipped, sliding over a few credit chips. "We just need a small, fast vessel," he says. The vendor peers at the payment and spits on the deck. "You'll need double that for anything that'll outrun your typical Imperial patrol." Syra stands silently, expression bored, but Lucian can sense her seething at being displayed like cargo. He curses under his breath, rummaging for more chips. The vendor snickers, obviously relishing the negotiating position. "We have one craft that might suit your needs. Old stealth cruiser. Not pretty, but it'll do." Lucian scowls. "Show me." They're led to a distant hangar bay reeking of fuel and rust. Inside sits a sleek, dark-hulled ship, battered at the edges but sporting advanced thruster pods. Lucian whistles softly, impressed despite himself. The vendor rattles off specs. Syra studies the craft with an aloof air. She can sense the stealth plating's faint resonance, an impressive piece of technology for a place this remote. "This'll cost you," the vendor says, voice oily. Lucian stiffens. "We'll take it." Before the man can protest the lack of final payment, Lucian draws a sidearm. "You'll get the rest once I'm sure it runs. No tricks." The vendor eyes Syra, then laughs nervously. All right. No need for that." He gestures to a console. "Test away." Lucian checks the ship's systems while Syra stands guard, or more accurately, stands with crossed arms, projecting a lethal aura that keeps the vendor at bay. Once Lucian verifies it's operational, he tosses the man a bag of chips, probably more than the hunk of junk is worth but less than a fair deal for a fully functional stealth cruiser. The vendor grumbles but doesn't push his luck. They make to board the stealth craft, Syra giving the battered kiosk one last look before disappearing inside. The bay doors seal behind them, giving them a moment of privacy. Inside, the cockpit is roomy, the pilot and co-pilot seats flanked by a pair of auxiliary stations. Lucian nods in approval, takes the helm, and powers it up. Syra stands near the hatch, the faint glow of her tattoos illuminating the cramped space. He tugs on her chain, drawing her attention. "Take a seat," he orders, voice clipped. Her glare could melt steel, but she complies. As they lift off, she says in a low tone, "If you think I'll remain docile forever, you're mistaken." He doesn't take his eyes off the controls. "I don't expect docile. I just expect you to remember who holds the detonator." She exhales, leaning back in the co-pilot's chair, never breaking eye contact. The tension in that small cockpit is suffocating once again, thick with unspoken challenges and unacknowledged sparks. They slip away from the station, the stealth cruiser's engines humming quietly. Once they're clear, Lucian sets a course deeper into uncharted space. Another jump, another chance to keep off the Empire's radar, or so he hopes. Syra angles her head, watching the stars streak by. "Is this your entire plan?" she asks, voice dripping with disdain. "Run and hide in the fringes while hoping the Empire forgets you exist?" He keeps his gaze fixed forward. "You don't get to question my plan," he retorts. She shakes her head in mocking disapproval. "What a waste of potential." He bites back a sharp response, unwilling to let her words get under his skin more than they already do. There is truth in what she says, a lingering frustration that has plagued him for years. He wants to do more than survive, he wants to strike back. But how to do that with limited resources? The princess might be the key to a bigger blow, if he can figure out how to use her. If he can keep himself from getting killed in the process. With a flash of starlight they jump. He leans back, letting autopilot take over once again. Another chunk of time in forced proximity. He can almost feel her eyes on him. She shifts in her seat, cuffs rattling. "If you're going to drag me around the galaxy, at least have the decency to unchain me," she says at last. He considers it, tapping the control panel that monitors her collar. "Not yet." She rolls her eyes, every breath seething with pent-up hostility. Yet for all her scorn, she hasn't tried to tear him apart since he gave her that partial release against the pirates. He wonders if she's plotting something deeper or if, on some level, she recognizes that staying with him a little longer might benefit her own agenda. His gaze slips over her, from the luminescent patterns across her arms to the subtle curve of her waist, trying to maintain a purely analytical vantage. He fails. His mind betrays him, conjuring the memory of how her power felt when she unleashed it, the primal surge that left him breathless. He can't deny a twisted fascination with this royal alien who stands as a symbol of everything he's fought against. She's dangerous, cunning, and infuriatingly captivating. The more time he spends in her presence, the more he feels a contradictory pull, a desire to best her, break her, or perhaps something else he refuses to name. She notices his scrutiny. Instead of calling him out, she lifts her chin, meeting his gaze with an imperious stare. A silent standoff. The hum of the stealth cruiser's engines underscores the tension. Neither breaks eye contact. Something in that charged silence feels like the precursor to violence, or something equally volatile. Then a console chime interrupts, announcing the arrival at their next coordinate. They blink, as though snapped out of a trance. He turns away, focusing on the readouts. She shifts again, crossing her legs, the movement calculated to draw his attention. He forces himself not to look. Moments later, the ship emerges near a barren planet ringed by shimmering debris. Sensors show no signs of life or significant technology. This might serve as a temporary hideout for repairs and planning. He sets the craft down on a patch of flat rock. The gravity is light, the atmosphere thin but breathable with a respirator. He unbuckles, rising to his feet. She watches him warily. "What now?" she asks. He grabs 2 respirators, tossing one to her. "We check for resources and keep a low profile. If you behave, I might let you stretch your legs." She curls her lip. "How generous." They descend the ramp, battered boots hitting gray dust. The horizon is desolate, dotted with sharp cliffs. A faint wind stirs, carrying metallic-tasting grit. He pulls on the respirator, adjusting the straps. She does the same, wrists still bound. The collar, however, remains deactivated enough to let her sense her surroundings more sharply. She turns in a slow circle, scanning the horizon. Despite the wasteland, something about the wide-open space momentarily captivates her. Perhaps she's been locked indoors for too long. He stands a few paces away, weapon holstered but hand always near it, just in case. She notices. "Afraid I'll take off running?" He huffs a short laugh, shaking his head. "I'd like to see you try." She considers the possibility for a heartbeat, then dismisses it. If she did run, she'd be stranded on this lifeless rock with little chance of survival, and the collar's kill switch remains with him. Reluctantly, she falls into step beside him, and they traverse a ridge, scanning for anything valuable or dangerous. In that forced companionship, the friction between them shifts, no less intense but channeled into the harsh environment. They exchange curt observations about the terrain. She picks up a handful of dust, letting it slip through her fingers. He checks a handheld scanner, frowning at the readings. Some mineral deposits. Not enough to be worth mining. No signs of structures. She stands near a jagged outcrop, arms resting at her sides. He notices how the low gravity accentuates her every movement, as if she's gliding over the rocks. In a moment of raw frustration, he storms up next to her, jaw clenched. "Why did you do it?" he demands suddenly, voice harsh in the open air. She turns slowly. "Do what?" He gestures broadly. "Your empire. Killing entire populations. Slaughtering thousands. Did you ever question it?" A flicker of emotion crosses her face, too quick to read. "You're asking me to defend an entire empire's actions?" He stares, breathing ragged. "You're next in line to rule, aren't you? So yes, I'm asking you." She lifts her chin, eyes narrowing behind the respirator's visor. "My father believes conquest is the path to survival. Our resources, our expansions, it's all about ensuring our species thrives. It's not personal, though your loss was no less tragic because of that." His stomach twists at her detached tone. "Not personal," he echoes, bitterness saturating his words. For me, it was my entire life. She says nothing, but something in her gaze looks almost regretful, if only for a fleeting second. Then, turning away, she lets the moment pass. In that instant, their enmity flares anew. He hates her empire for its brutality. She upholds it out of loyalty or necessity. Yet somewhere in the tangle of hatred, there's a shared spark of understanding that nothing about their situation is simple. They continue deeper into the rocky expanse, wind tugging at their clothes. The planet's weak sun dips behind the cliffs, casting elongated shadows. Soon, the temperature plummets, and the wind picks up. A swirl of dust rises, prompting them to return to the shelter of their new ship. Once inside, they strip off the respirators. She rubs her shackled wrists, clearly weary from the day's exertions. He eyes her for a moment before tossing her a ration pack. She catches it, tears it open without a word. Neither thanks the other. They simply exist in that shared space, forced together by fate and necessity. Hours pass in stifling silence, broken only by the beep of scanners periodically scanning for any sign of approaching ships. He busies himself with calibrating the stealth systems, checking that the engines remain operational. She remains near the main hatch, occasionally pacing despite the cuffs. It's a restless dance, both of them like caged beasts. Eventually, he finishes his work, turning to find her watching him again. He squares his shoulders, crossing the small cabin. They stand a few feet apart, the hum of the ship's power core thrumming beneath their feet. "So, what's next?" she asks quietly, voice subdued. He exhales, running a hand through his hair. "We gather intel on your father's next move, locate a weak point, and exploit it. That's how this ends." Her eyes flick to the collar around her neck, then back to him. "Do you really believe a single human, even with a hostage, can threaten the Empire?" He gazes at her evenly. "Maybe not alone. But there are factions, rebels, defectors. Your capture could spark something bigger." She tilts her head, studying him with a calculating expression. "You're more cunning than you appear. You plan to use me as a rallying symbol for your cause. Is that it?" He shrugs, refusing to confirm or deny. Her lips press into a thin line, some private thought roiling behind her eyes. The tension between them is a tangible force, equal parts anger and something dangerously close to attraction. Each step they take together is a step deeper into that uncharted territory. He moves to the side panel, flipping a switch that dims the interior lights. "We should rest," he says. "The next jump will be long, and I'd rather not waste resources here." She nods once, expression guarded. "Fine. But I won't sleep in chains like an animal." His mouth twists. "I can't trust you without them." She arches a brow. "I could have attacked you a dozen times by now." He hesitates, a frown forming. Slowly, he removes a small key fob from his pocket. She watches every movement, a flicker of hope or triumph in her eyes. Then, with a heavy sigh, he steps behind her and unlocks the cuffs, though the collar remains. The metal falls away, leaving faint red marks on her wrists. She rubs them, a small grimace crossing her face. He steps back warily, sidearm still within reach. "Don't make me regret this." She rolls her shoulders, exhaling softly. "I keep my word," she says. "If I wanted you dead, you'd already be bleeding on the floor." A moment's silence stretches. Something unspoken lingers in the charged air, an acknowledgement that they've reached a new level of precarious trust. Or perhaps not trust, just an arrangement. She steps away, settling on a small bunk in the corner, while he takes the other. The cabin lights remain low, flickering across the walls. Tired as he is, his body refuses to relax, tension coiled in every muscle. He steals a glance at her. She's lying on her side, facing away from him, the collar's dull glow illuminating the sharp line of her jaw. He closes his eyes, forcing his mind to quiet, though it's a losing battle. He's hyper-aware of her presence, the steady rhythm of her breaths. Every fiber of him remains on alert for a sudden betrayal. Yet as minutes crawl by, no attack comes. In that uneasy lull, his thoughts drift to the countless battles, the scorched remains of his home, and how everything he's done has led to this moment, lying a few feet away from an alien princess who embodies the very empire he despises. Sleep eventually claims him with a cold, bitter hold. When he awakens, a dull ache sets in, and he half expects to find her gone or looming over him with a knife. Instead, she's still on her bunk, silent, eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. He rises, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. She sits up, and they exchange guarded looks. Neither acknowledges the shared vulnerability of having slept in each other's presence without violence. He flips a few switches on the console, checking scanners. All clear. He sets coordinates for the next jump. She stands and stretches, the fine muscles of her arms flexing beneath those luminous markings. He resolutely avoids staring too long. Once they're back in the pilot and co-pilot seats, he initiates the hyperjump, the ship shuddering as it tears through space. She rubs her wrist again, a reminder that though she's currently uncuffed, she's still wearing the collar. He wonders if her powers could break it if she exerted enough force, but she hasn't tried, yet. Maybe she's plotting something more elaborate. His trust in her is virtually non-existent, but they have bigger problems. They need intel, allies, resources. Hours stretch into a blur of star-laced darkness. They speak little, exchanging only the necessary words to keep the ship flying. Despite the silence, the undercurrent of tension persists, magnified by the occasional brush of arms as they pass each other in the cramped quarters. Each touch, however unintentional, feels charged. He hears her catch her breath once when their eyes meet in a narrow doorway. She quickly masks it with a scowl, turning away. But he felt it. A spark. The line between them, once defined by hatred and necessity, now crackles with another layer neither has the courage or desire to name. When they finally drop out of hyperspace near another rundown station, this one larger, busier, they prepare for another round of discreet docking. Syra glances at him. "We're repeating the same pattern," she remarks, voice edged with skepticism. "Land on a station, rummage for crumbs of info. You have no real plan, do you?" He scowls. "I have a plan. The plan is to find a lead on your father's next offensive. We can't fight blindly." She makes a derisive noise but doesn't argue. Soon, they're among the hustle of a neon-lit docking bay, dozens of ships from every corner of the galaxy jockeying for berths. The smell of engine oil and stale air hits them as they step onto the platform. This time, she's not in chains, but the collar remains locked. He keeps a watchful eye on her, though the crowd's presence offers her a chance to disappear if she wants. Yet she stays close, perhaps because escaping now would serve no purpose. They wade through throngs of travelers, merchants hawking wares, gamblers leaning over dice games. A few alien species hiss or glare at them, but no one challenges them outright. Lucian scans the crowd, searching for a familiar contact or a lead. He spots a grizzled figure by a hollow kiosk, someone he vaguely recognizes from past dealings. He gestures Syra to follow as he approaches the woman. She's tall, with a prosthetic arm, hair braided tight against her scalp. She glances at Syra and raises a brow. "Long time, Lucian," the woman drawls. "Heard you went after the Empire's big guns." He smirks. "A few scuffles, yeah? I'm looking for intel on the Empire's next big campaign." The woman eyes Syra with interest, then shrugs. "Word is, the Empire's massing ships near the Kelner Rift. Something about a hidden temple or artifact. Could be crucial to their war machine." Syra stiffens at that, lips parting. Lucian notices her reaction. The woman continues, "That's all I know. And if you're smart, you'll stay clear of it." He tosses her a credit chit and thanks. She pockets it, eyes lingering on Syra. "Careful with that one," she warns, as if sensing trouble. Syra smirks but doesn't respond. The woman shrugs and disappears into the crowd. Lucian turns to Syra, who's staring at him with unreadable eyes. "A temple in the Kelner Rift?" he repeats. "What do you know about that?" She doesn't answer right away, scanning the bustling corridor around them. Finally, she leans in, voice low. "If my father's heading there, it's no ordinary artifact. Legend says an ancient power is buried beneath the rift, something that could shift the balance in any war. He reads the flicker of concern in her eyes, mingled with her usual arrogance. We need to stop him, Lucian says. She stares at him like he's a fool. You can't just stroll into the rift and expect to sabotage the Emperor's expedition. He narrows his eyes. Then tell me how to do it. Or would you rather see him gain more power? She sets her jaw, clearly torn. If he obtains whatever's there, the Empire might become unstoppable. But you're delusional if you think you can do this alone. He squares his shoulders. I won't be alone. You're coming with me. Her lips part in protest, but he cuts her off. You have no love for your father's tyranny, do you? Not entirely. Otherwise, you'd be fighting me every step of the way. She glares, but something in his words strikes a chord. Finally, she exhales sharply. Fine. She mutters. I'll show you the approach. But if we get caught, we won't live to regret it. He nods, a grim smile tugging at his mouth. Let's gear up. Then we head to the rift. She stiffens in something akin to reluctant agreement, and they turn back to the ship, each feeling the weight of the unspoken alliance that's formed. They weave through the station's labyrinthine corridors, collecting supplies, currency, forging false documents if needed. With every step, Lucian can't help but note how Syra moves through the crowd, confident, regal, ignoring the whispers and stares at her collar. The friction between them never lessens, but it morphs, twisting into a shared purpose they can't quite define. They speak in curt, clipped sentences, but each word pulses with an undercurrent of tension. Passers-by might assume they're simply partners, but neither is foolish enough to believe that's the truth. They're enemies forced into an uneasy truce, with the specter of betrayal looming over every interaction. And yet, the threads of attraction that coil beneath the surface remain, unstoppable as gravity, pulling them into orbits they both resent and crave. By the time they're back aboard their stealth cruiser, loaded with enough rations and gear to mount a small expedition, both wear the weight of what's to come. He secures the hatch, and she stands near the cockpit controls, arms folded. I'll punch in coordinates for the rift, she offers tersely. He steps aside, letting her input the data. Her knowledge of Imperial Star routes is invaluable, and he's not too proud to let her guide them. As she works, he can't ignore how close they stand, the subtle perfume of her alien scent drifting into his senses. The swirling patterns on her arms catch the low cockpit light, mesmerizing in their slow pulsing. He grits his teeth against a flash of unwanted desire, reminding himself of his purpose. There, she says, straightening. If we follow that course, we can slip around the Empire's outer patrols. He nods, ignoring the racing of his heart. Good. We leave immediately. She arches a brow in faint amusement at his clipped tone. Lead on, fearless captor. She mocks. He doesn't rise to the bait, settling into the pilot's seat. Soon, the engines rumble, and they detach from the station. Within minutes, they're threading through the starry void again, heading into deeper, darker waters, where one of the greatest powers in the galaxy might be waiting, and with it, the final confrontation that will either bind them together or tear them apart for good. They drop out of hyperspace near the Kellner Rift, a region of space notorious for its gravitational anomalies and swirling cosmic dust storms. The star charts flicker on the console, half of them incomplete or contradictory. Syra points to a cluster of swirling energy storms. That's where we need to go. Lucian frowns at the readouts. Looks suicidal. She shrugs. Welcome to my life, human. He sets his jaw, guiding the ship forward. The stealth plating crackles, trying to compensate for the intense electromagnetic interference. The hull vibrates with each wave of cosmic force. Outside the viewport, luminous ribbons of charged particles swirl and clash, painting the darkness in electric purples and blues. He maneuvers carefully, scanning for any sign of Imperial vessels. Syra's posture is tense, eyes darting between readouts. He can sense her apprehension. This place is dangerous enough without an Imperial fleet presence. Yet if her father is searching for something here, they'll undoubtedly have advanced scouts. Sure enough, the sensor picks up faint signals, multiple capital ships, half a sector away, seemingly orbiting a massive station on the far side of the rift. We'll have to approach from the underside, Syra murmurs, pointing to a gap in the swirling storms. There's a corridor of relative calm that leads to the planet's surface. That's where the artifact is rumored to lie. But we'll need to land a few kilometers out and proceed on foot. He nods, mouth set in a grim line. We'd better hope that corridor is real. I'm not about to get shredded by cosmic winds. They dive into the rift, the ship rattling so violently he fears it might tear apart. Syra braces a hand against the console, her luminous tattoos flickering with each jolt. For a moment, her eyes meet his, and a silent acknowledgement of the risk passes between them. They won't survive this if they don't trust each other, at least with their lives. Hate each other if they must, but rely on each other's skills if they hope to make it through. He focuses on the instruments, ignoring the swirl of contradictory feelings in his gut. After a harrowing descent, they break through the shimmering clouds, emerging into an eerie sky that glows with ionized gases. Below lies a jagged landscape of black rock and luminous crystal formations. Storms rage on the horizon, purple lightning arcing through cloud banks. He finds a relatively flat area to set down the ship, deploying landing struts with a heavy thud. The engines whine and power down. When the dust settles, they stare out the cockpit windows at the alien terrain. It's both beautiful and foreboding, an alien hush blanketing the area despite the crackle of distant thunder. Syra exhales, tension easing from her shoulders just a fraction. We made it, she says, voice subdued. Lucian stands, checking his gear, a blaster rifle, sidearm, portable sensor array, and a backpack of supplies. He tosses her a smaller pack. You're carrying your share, he announces curtly. She catches it, rummages through the contents. Med kit, some rations, scanning devices. You came prepared. He slings his own pack over his shoulder. I'm not a fool. She gives him a pointed look. That remains to be seen. They lower the ramp and step onto a rocky plateau. The wind is cold and dry, carrying a faint static that makes their hair stand on end. She flips open a handheld scanner, calibrating it to the planet's harsh electromagnetic field. He watches her with cautious respect. This is her domain, in a way, alien worlds, advanced scanning technology. She might have grown up in palaces, but her empire's constant expansion meant she was trained from birth to navigate hostile environments. He can't deny she's good at it. Together, they surveyed the terrain, noting large crystal spires that jut from the ground like fangs. Light from the swirling sky refracts off them, creating shifting patterns of color across the rocks. According to the legends, Syra says, voice hushed by the wind, the temple is buried deep in a canyon beyond those spires. If my father's forces arrived ahead of us, we'll find them there. Lucian nods, scanning the horizon with his rifle's scope. We move fast, stay low. We sabotage whatever they're doing, or we get that artifact first. Then we destroy it. She arches a brow at him. Destroy it? You assume it's destructive by nature. His grip on the rifle tightens. Everything your father covets is destructive by nature. She doesn't argue. Together they begin their trek across the plateau, stepping carefully among jagged rocks. The planet's surface is treacherous, with hidden crevasses and unstable ground. At one point Syra slips, a loose rock tumbling away beneath her foot. Lucian instinctively grabs her arm, steadying her. She stiffens at the contact, eyes flashing with annoyance. I can handle myself. He lets go immediately. Fine. They continue in sullen silence, but that moment of contact lingers, as though each secretly registered something in the other: human warmth, alien heat, a bridging of two bodies that normally recoil from each other. Neither acknowledges it out loud. As they approach the spires, the air grows denser, charged with crackling energy that sets their nerves on edge. Syra consults the scanner. There's a large concentration of metallic structures a few kilometers to the east. Likely Imperial equipment. He nods, scanning the ground with a handheld device. Signs of a landing zone, footprints, vehicle tracks. They're here. Their eyes meet over the scanners, and though they share a mutual sense of dread, they also feel an unexpected surge of determination. For all their differences, they're united in preventing the Emperor from claiming whatever lies in the depths of this planet. They move quickly, each step fraught with the possibility of an ambush. The wind howls, and occasionally, a burst of purple lightning crosses the sky, casting their shadows in wild shapes. Eventually, they spot the faint glow of artificial lights in a distant canyon, confirming the presence of Imperial forces. Lucian motions for her to stay low. She rolls her eyes but drops into a crouch, moving with predatory grace behind a line of boulders. Together, they peer into the canyon. Down below, an Imperial excavation site sprawls, lit by tall floodlights that battle the gloom. Troops patrol the perimeter, and massive drills bore into the canyon floor. A half-buried structure of dark stone juts from the rock, etched with ancient symbols that glow faintly whenever lightning flashes overhead. Syra's eyes widen. That's it, she breathes. The Temple of Kirkan, if the stories hold true. Lucian studies the heavy trooper presence. Tanks, energy barriers, a command tent with the Imperial insignia. We don't stand a chance head-on, he mutters. She scowls, but agrees. We'll need stealth. Maybe sabotage. If we can disrupt their power supply, we might buy time to get inside that temple. He checks his gear. You up for it? She lifts her chin defiantly. Are you? A moment of shared adrenaline surges. They slip down the canyon's edge, using the shadows cast by the rocky outcroppings to mask their approach. Occasionally, they duck behind boulders as a patrol passes. Their hearts pound in tandem, the tension between them merging with the danger of infiltration. At one point, a trooper nearly spots them, but Syra quickly presses herself flat against the rock, pulling Lucian down beside her. Their bodies collide, and he's enveloped by her heat, the alien glow of her markings shining faintly in the darkness. She holds a finger to her lips, eyes locked with his until the trooper moves on. They wait in breathless stillness, faces only inches apart. The air between them crackles, the same energy that saturates this entire planet seeming to spark through their proximity. A surge of awareness floods them both, a moment of suspended conflict where the distinction between friend and foe blurs. His pulse thunders, and he's sure she can feel it. Then she exhales softly, tension uncoiling enough to let them separate. Neither speaks as they continue forward, each acutely conscious that something between them has shifted yet again. They reach the edge of the encampment, where a series of cables run from a portable reactor to the floodlights and drills. Syra crouches beside the humming generator, scanning it with a practiced eye. I can overload this, she whispers, but it'll trigger an alarm. Lucian nods grimly. Better that than letting them keep drilling unopposed. She sets to work, carefully rewiring the cables with surges of her own energy manipulations. He stands guard, rifle primed. At any second, a patrol could round the corner. Sweat beads at his temples. She splices a final wire. Sparks fly, and the generator hums ominously, ramping up to a dangerous pitch. They scramble away, diving behind a crate just as a deafening pop echoes across the site. Floodlights wink out, one by one, as the meltdown cascades through the power grid. Alarms shriek. Troopers shout, fanning out in confusion. In the sudden darkness, they see an opening to slip past the perimeter and toward the half-buried temple. Lucian grabs Syra's hand, pulling her into the swirling gloom. She doesn't resist, at least not now, as they race through the chaos. Scattered muzzle flashes strobe the canyon walls, and in the confusion, they dodge around disoriented soldiers. Lightning flares overhead, revealing the temple entrance, an ornate doorway framed by alien script. A squad of troopers stands guard, but they're distracted by the failing lights. Syra narrows her eyes, conjuring a quick flicker of energy that leaps from her fingertips. The collar crackles in protest, but she manages to stun them, a wave of sizzling power knocking them unconscious. Lucian wastes no time, hauling one trooper aside to clear the path. Then, side by side, they slip into the temple's dark maw. Inside, the walls are etched with luminescent glyphs, pulsating softly like a heartbeat. The air is stale, carrying the scent of ancient dust. They edge forward, boots echoing on the stone floor. Behind them, the sound of troopers regrouping grows distant. For the moment, they're alone in the temple's echoing corridor, lit only by the faint glow of these alien runes and the occasional flicker of purple lightning from cracks in the rock ceiling. Lucian's breathing is shallow, adrenaline spiking anew as he contemplates what might lie deeper within. Syra's expression is taut with wary fascination. She runs a hand over one of the glyphs, and it flashes brighter at her touch. He lifts his rifle, scanning for threats. "Careful," he warns. She nods, still transfixed by the swirling patterns. "This place is more alive than I expected," she murmurs. They press onward, passing through grand arches and crumbling chambers. The architecture is unlike anything Lucian has seen, a blend of organic curves and sharp crystalline angles, as though grown rather than built. Syra's tension mounts with each step, her luminous markings seeming to resonate with the temple's glow. Lucian notices her labored breathing, the collar's lights flickering erratically. "You okay?" he asks, a rare note of concern creeping into his voice. She shakes her head. "This place, it's pulsing with an energy that's older than my empire. I can feel it through the collar's dampening field. If my father harnesses this, who knows what he could do?" Her words weigh on him. He steps ahead, rounding a corner into a vast chamber dominated by a monolithic altar of black stone. Strange vines, or perhaps cables, stretch across the floor and walls, converging on the altar. The glyphs covering it pulse like a giant heart. Syra approaches cautiously, and Lucian grips his rifle, scanning for any sign of a trap. The hair on the back of his neck stands on end, as if the air itself hums with potential. Suddenly, a voice booms from behind them. "So you've come here, princess? I expected no less." They spin around to see a figure clad in ornate armor, flanked by two imposing guards, Syra's father, the emperor. Shock ripples across Syra's face, though she masks it quickly. The emperor's gaze flicks over Lucian with contempt. "A human soldier?" he sneers. "This is your grand rebellion, daughter?" Syra's jaw sets, anger burning behind her eyes. Lucian raises his rifle, but one of the emperor's guards levels a plasma halberd, forcing him to hold off. The emperor steps forward, every inch a conqueror, red eyes shining with cruel amusement. "Did you truly think you could stop me from claiming the power of Kirkan? You've led me right to the temple's heart." Lucian's hand clenches the weapon. Syra stands tall despite the collar around her neck. "I won't let you have it," she declares, voice echoing in the chamber. The emperor laughs, a cold, grating sound that reverberates through the ancient stone. "Your defiance is meaningless. Once I unlock this altar, the galaxy will bend to my will." A sinister hush falls over the chamber, the glyphs intensifying. Lucian can feel Syra tensing beside him, the pulse of her power struggling against the collar's constraints. The emperor lifts a metal scepter, etched with the same runes that adorn the walls. He aims it at the altar, speaking words in a forgotten tongue. The glyphs flare blindingly bright, and a thunderous hum shakes the foundation of the temple. Lucian staggers, pressing a hand to his ear. Syra clenches her fists, fighting the overload of energy surging around them. The emperor cackles triumphantly. "Behold the ancient might of Kirkan." Despite the impending doom, Lucian and Syra exchange a fierce glance. In that moment, the raw synergy that's built between them ignites. He sets his jaw, stepping forward to distract the emperor while Syra tries to channel her own energy. One of the guards lunges, halberd slicing the air. Lucian ducks and fires, the shot grazing the guard's armor. Another guard charges Syra, but she conjures a burst of crackling power. The collar sparks, fighting to contain her, but she pushes through, sending the guard crashing into a wall. The emperor sneers, turning his scepter on them, energy swirling at the tip. "You cannot stand against me." Lucian lines up a shot, but the emperor's power knocks him back, hurling him against the stone floor. Pain explodes in his shoulder as he lands hard, weapon skittering away. Syra lashes out, but her father's power eclipses hers, forcing her to her knees. She gasps, the collar draining her strength, the temple's energies swirling out of control. The emperor channels a final surge, preparing to unleash a killing blow. Lucian, dazed, sees an opening as the emperor's attention focuses on Syra. Summoning his last reserves, he lunges, snatching his sidearm. He fires a single shot that strikes the scepter. The impact cracks the ancient relic, interrupting the flow of energy. A deafening explosion of light engulfs the altar. The Emperor staggers, roaring in rage, as the power he unleashed spirals out of control. The glyphs pulse in chaotic flashes, and the ground quakes. Syra seizes the moment, straining against the collar to channel one focused blast. Her eyes blaze, every marking on her body lit with fierce brilliance. She directs the energy at the Emperor, forcing him to reel back. The swirling power from the altar lashes out like tendrils, ravaging the chamber. Lucian scrambles to her side, shielding his eyes from the radiant flares. The Emperor, battered by the feedback of the broken scepter, snarls and retreats, the temple collapsing around him. Cracks open in the walls, the ceiling raining down debris. "Go!" Lucian shouts, grabbing Syra's arm. She lurches to her feet, both of them sprinting for the exit as the temple shudders violently. The Emperor's voice echoes behind them, furious and vengeful. They reach the corridor and dart through falling stones, dust choking the air. Distantly, they hear the clash of Imperial troops also trying to flee. The entire canyon quakes, lightning storms intensifying outside. They emerge into open air just as a massive chunk of the temple collapses behind them, sealing away the altar and its volatile power. Coughing from the dust, hearts pounding, they stagger away from the rubble. In the distance, Imperial forces scramble to evacuate. Shuttles lift off, battered by the planet's tumultuous atmosphere. It's chaos, but they've managed to stop the Emperor from claiming Kirkan's full power, for now. They half-run, half-limp back toward the stealth cruiser, adrenaline carrying them. Neither speaks, their breathing ragged, each grappling with the magnitude of what just happened. When they finally spot the ship, battered but intact, it feels like a lifeline. Lucian hits the ramp controls, and they stumble aboard, slamming it shut behind them. He collapses into the pilot's seat, Syra into the co-pilot's, both covered in dust, bruises, and sweat. For a moment, they just breathe, the hum of the engines a stark contrast to the raging storm outside. Then Lucian powers up the thrusters, setting them aloft, leaving the collapsing temple behind. The planet storms buffet the ship, but they push through, escaping into the upper atmosphere. When they finally break into space, the starry void feels like salvation. Lucian sets a course away from the Imperial ships, many of which appear to be retreating. Syra sits in silence, staring at her hands, the collar still faintly crackling. Outside, the swirling cosmic fury of the rift glitters ominously. "It's done," Lucian rasps. "We stopped him. At least for now." She lifts her gaze, exhaustion and relief warring on her features. "You risked your life," she murmurs, voice trembling with adrenaline and something else. He shrugs, swallowing thickly. "So did you." In the cramped cockpit, the tension that has plagued them from the start resurfaces, but now it's different, tempered by shared survival. She watches him, and he sees in her eyes a flicker of acknowledgement. They've crossed a threshold. They saved each other, defied the Emperor together. Slowly, she touches the collar at her neck, the device that still hums with suppressed power. He meets her gaze, and for a heartbeat neither moves. Then, with steady hands, he reaches for the collar's release mechanism, the final step in setting her free. Her breath catches as he hesitates, searching her face for any sign of betrayal. She says nothing, just watches him with those golden eyes, vulnerable for the first time since he met her. He flips the latch, the collar clicks open, and it falls away. A final shudder ripples through her, the glow of her markings surging once before settling into a calm luminescence. She brings a hand to her throat, massaging the raw skin. He sets the collar aside, bracing himself for whatever might come next. She exhales, a long, slow release of tension, and then she looks at him with an unreadable expression. In those few seconds of silence, something passes between them, gratitude, respect, and perhaps even the beginning of acceptance. He isn't sure of who moves first. Maybe they both do. But suddenly, they're close, the exhaustion and the relief and the clash of their personalities igniting in one final explosion of tension. Her hands grip the front of his jacket, pulling him toward her. He doesn't resist, though 1,000 warnings flare in his mind. Their mouths meet in a fierce, desperate kiss, not gentle but fueled by raw adrenaline and mutual surrender. It's as if all the pent-up aggression, hatred, and unexpected desire converge in that singular moment, forging a connection they can't deny. The cockpit lights flicker, and the ship's alarms remind them they're not safe yet. But neither cares. They cling to each other, breath mingling, hearts hammering in frantic unison. When they break apart, the look in her eyes is a mix of longing and defiance. He cups her cheek, ignoring the voice in his head that says this is insanity. She leans into his touch, luminous tattoos pulsing softly against his skin. They don't speak. Words would only complicate the fragile understanding that's blossomed. Instead, he brushes his forehead against hers, a single moment of vulnerability. Outside, the stars stretch endless, and the threat of the Empire still looms. But they've crossed a line that neither can retreat from. After a minute, they separate, each returning to their seat. He sets the ship on a steady course, exhaling shakily. She sits with her hands in her lap, eyes closed, as if processing the onslaught of emotions. The memory of their kiss lingers in the pressurized air. It's not a promise of peace or a vow of love, just a raw acknowledgement that after everything they've endured, they've chosen not to be enemies. With the stealth cruiser slicing through the darkness, they slip away from the rift. The Emperor's ambitions have been thwarted for now, and the artifact's power remains buried beneath the rubble of Kirkan's temple. Outside the viewport, distant lightning flashes, a reminder of how close they came to destruction. But in the cockpit, a new equilibrium settles, one built on shared survival, simmering attraction, and the slow realization that they might just be stronger together than apart. The future remains uncertain, but in that moment, as the battered ship drifts into the unknown, they both know there's no going back to who they were. And for the first time, that possibility tastes more like liberation than defeat. They don't speak of the kiss during the next hours of flight, each lost in thought. Lucian navigates the cruiser into the outer rim of uncharted space, plotting a course that will keep them far from the Empire's main routes. Syra stays in the co-pilot's seat, occasionally adjusting readings or scanning for any sign of pursuit. Her posture remains regal, but there's a softness around her eyes that wasn't there before. The collar that once subdued her sits discarded in a storage compartment, a potent symbol of the barriers they've broken. Eventually, Lucian breaks the silence. We need to talk about what happens now. She glances at him, the corner of her mouth tightening. Yes. My father won't stop. He'll gather forces, scour that temple site, perhaps search for other secrets. You've made yourself an even bigger target. He gives a sardonic chuckle. Not the first time. She studies him for a moment, as though weighing the cost of sincerity. The Empire might not recover from the fiasco at Kirkan easily. If you strike soon, you may have an advantage. He exhales, eyes flicking to the star-studded horizon. I can't do it alone. The rebels, other disenfranchised worlds, they might help, but only if I can unify them. Her expression remains guarded, but he senses a shift. You have me, she says quietly. He looks at her, surprised by her frankness. She stiffens at his reaction, adding quickly, Don't misunderstand. I'm no friend to the Empire's downfall if it means chaos for my people. But I see now that my father's rule is unsustainable. He nods slowly, unsure how to respond. A wave of relief mingles with the complexity of forging an alliance with someone who was, until recently, his sworn enemy. They let the conversation settle, both acknowledging that the road ahead is paved with uncertainty. Instead, they focus on basic tasks, scanning for water sources, checking the ship's systems, making sure there's enough fuel to reach the next sanctuary. Time moves in a strange blur, each hour stretching with the weight of all that's happened. Eventually, they slip into a lull. Syra stands rolling her stiff shoulders, the luminescent patterns on her skin dim to a gentle glow. He glances up from the controls. You should rest, he says, voice gentler than before. She quirks a brow. You too. He gestures to the bunk area. One of us has to monitor the ship. Go. A small smile touches her lips, and she steps away, disappearing into the next compartment. He exhales once she's gone, raking a hand through his hair. Emotions churn inside him: residual anger, raw attraction, the embers of hatred, and the flicker of something like hope. It's a maelstrom he never expected. After a while, he sets the ship's autopilot and wanders toward the rear cabin. The door slides open with a soft hiss. She's seated on the edge of a bunk, a distant look in her eyes. She meets his gaze, tension swirling anew. He hesitates in the doorway, uncertain if intruding is wise. "I wanted to check on your injuries," he offers, voice gruff. She arches her neck, showing bruises from the collar, the faint red lines around her wrists. "They'll heal," she says. "I've had worse in training." He nods, stepping closer, rummaging in a small med kit. "Let me at least treat the bruising." She stiffens, then exhales, offering her wrists. He kneels, gently applying a salve that reduces swelling and disinfects any abrasions. The act feels intimate, a stark contrast to the violence of their earliest encounters. Her eyes watch him carefully, but she doesn't pull away. When he finishes, he sits back on his heels. The cabin lights cast flickering shadows, illuminating the fine lines of her face. He notices her mouth, remembers how it felt pressed to his. A raw wave of longing hits him. She must sense it because her expression shifts, something in her gaze softening. Slowly, she lifts a hand, brushing the back of her fingers against his jaw. He shudders at the contact. "Why are you doing this?" she whispers, voice nearly lost in the quiet. He swallows, unsure how to articulate the whirlwind inside him. "I don't know," he admits. "Maybe because we both need something to hold on to that isn't just hate." She closes her eyes as if pained. "Do you still hate me?" He hesitates, then shakes his head slowly. "I hate what your father did. But you're not him." A tremor passes through her. "I've done things I'm not proud of," she murmurs, guilt flashing in her eyes. "But maybe it's not too late to change." He exhales, tension bleeding from his shoulders. "It's not," he says quietly, the words coming out before he can second-guess them. They linger in that fragile bubble. Then, as if drawn by a force neither can resist, she leans forward, and their lips meet again. This time, the kiss is slower, a testing of boundaries rather than a clash. He grips her arms gently, feeling the warmth of her skin through the swirling tattoos. She sighs against his mouth, an almost sorrowful sound, as though every moment of closeness reminds her of the vast gulf that once separated them. When they break apart, foreheads pressed together, they share a silence that feels oddly comforting. He shifts, sitting beside her on the bunk. They stay like that, side by side, shoulders touching. She traces a pattern on her thigh, luminous lines shimmering under her fingertips. "I never asked for this," she admits. "To be a tool of conquest. To carry the weight of an empire's cruelty. But it's all I knew." He nods, letting her words wash over him. He can't forgive everything her empire has done, but he can't deny the sincerity of her regret. "Maybe that's enough for now." After a moment, he says softly, "If we're going to stand against him, your father, we'll need each other. I can't do it alone. Neither can you." She looks at him, eyes reflecting the cabin lights like molten gold. "Then we'll do it," she says, voice unwavering. "Together." A surge of fierce resolve floods him. He takes her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. They remain that way for a long moment, joined by a tenuous hope that neither dared imagine when they first met. The future is uncertain, the challenge is daunting, but in each other they've found a spark strong enough to light a path forward. When they finally drift into an exhausted sleep, it's with the quiet understanding that no matter what dangers lie ahead, they'll face them side by side. Morning, or what passes for morning in deep space, comes in the form of a soft chime from the console. They rouse themselves, exchanging a brief, meaningful glance that carries echoes of the night's fragile intimacy. In the cockpit, the scanners reveal no immediate threats. Syra sets a course for a remote sector rumored to be a gathering place for rebel cells. Lucian checks the stealth systems one last time. They hold. With a rumble, the cruiser slips into hyperspace, leaving behind the black rock planet and the memory of Kirkan's temple. Seated in the pilot's chair, Lucian is acutely aware of Syra behind him, leaning against the bulkhead. When he finishes inputting the coordinates, he turns. She crosses her arms, that familiar mix of pride and uncertainty in her stance. "We're going to try uniting the splinter groups?" she asks. He nods. "They won't trust me easily, let alone you. But we have proof the Emperor was nearly unstoppable at Kirkan. Maybe that will convince them we need to act. Together, we might stand a chance of toppling him." She presses her lips into a thin line. "If they refuse?" He exhales. "Then we find another way. I won't stop until your father answers for what he's done." Her eyes flick away, a moment of introspection passing over her features. "Neither will I," she concedes. The ship hums around them, the autopilot engaged, giving them a rare moment of stillness in the swirling chaos of the galaxy. He stands, crossing the short distance to her. She tenses slightly, but doesn't move away. Gently, he lifts a hand, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Her breath catches, and for a second, it feels like the entire world is contained in that small space between them. "Syra," he begins, voice rough, unsure how to phrase what he wants to say. She silences him by placing her palm over his heart. The warmth of her skin seeps through his shirt, and he can't help the small tremor it provokes. "We don't have to define this," she murmurs, eyes holding his with a steady light. "We only need to move forward." He nods, chest tight. They stand like that, suspended in mutual understanding, before she withdraws her hand, turning back toward the cockpit windows. He releases a breath he didn't know he was holding. Their journey stretches on, each hour bringing them closer to the rendezvous with potential allies. They speak in hushed tones about tactics, about the Empire's vulnerabilities, about the complexities of forging alliances in a galaxy so scarred by war. Yet even in these pragmatic discussions, a current of intimacy flows beneath their words, an unspoken acknowledgement that they're bound by more than just necessity now. When they finally drop out of hyperspace near a nondescript system of dusty planets and asteroid belts, a small cluster of ships pings their comm. Lucian identifies them as a rebel cell. Syra stands at his shoulder, tension radiating through her body. "Will they recognize me?" she asks quietly. He nods. "Probably. And they might shoot first. But I'll negotiate." They open a channel, exchanging terse greetings with the rebel leader. Suspicion crackles across the comm, but curiosity peaks when Lucian hints they have valuable intel on the Emperor's darkest secret. A meeting is arranged on a barren moon. As the stealth cruiser sets down on gray dust, Syra's expression tightens with old pride warring against new purpose. Lucian steps forward, taking her hand briefly, offering silent reassurance. She squeezes his fingers, then releases him, readying herself for the confrontation ahead. The ramp descends, revealing half a dozen armed rebels waiting under the harsh glare of a pale sun. Their weapons immediately swing up at the sight of Syra, the Emperor's daughter. She lifts her chin, refusing to flinch. Lucian steps between them, arms raised. "She's here as an ally," he declares. "We have information that can bring the Empire down." A murmur of shock ripples through the group. The rebel leader, a scarred woman with a cybernetic eye, narrows her gaze. "You expect me to believe the Emperor's spawn is on our side?" Syra stands firm, gaze unwavering. "I'm no one's spawn," she corrects icily. "And I've seen firsthand what must be done to stop him." The rebel leader looks to Lucian, who nods grimly. "We barely stopped him at Kirkan. If he finishes what he started, none of us will be free." A heavy silence drags, tension thick in the dusty air. Then, with a clipped motion, the rebel leader lowers her rifle. "Talk," she says, eyes flicking warily between Syra and Lucian. They spend hours in a makeshift command tent, hashing out the truth of what happened at the temple, the Emperor's intentions, and the stolen blueprint for a large-scale invasion that Syra reveals from her memory. Suspicion gradually yields to reluctant acceptance as the rebels realize the magnitude of the danger. By the end, an uneasy alliance forms. The rebels will call their allies, gather intelligence on the Emperor's mobilization, and plan a coordinated strike before he can recover from the Kirkan debacle. Syra's presence is contentious, Half the rebels still eye her with open hostility, but Lucian's vehement defense of her motives, along with her own frank disclosures, convinces them not to shoot her on sight. As the sun dips behind jagged rocks, Lucian and Syra return to their stealth cruiser. The day's negotiations have drained them both. She collapses into the co-pilot's seat with a weary sigh. He powers up the engines, tension knotting his neck. "We've taken the first step," he says, voice muted by exhaustion. She nods, gaze fixed on the horizon. "There's no going back." He can't help a small, humorless chuckle. "Would we want to?" She shakes her head, eyes shining with something that might be hope. "No," she whispers. Then she looks at him, and in that moment, the shared burden of what they've chosen to do melds with the growing bond they've forged. It's not a victory, but it's a start. He sets a course for the rendezvous the rebels suggested, a place where they can meet a larger coalition. As the cruiser lifts off the moon, Syra leans back, letting her eyes close. He watches her for a moment, taking in the regal lines of her face, the luminescent tattoos that have become as familiar as his own scars. A conflicted wave of affection and caution surges through him. Neither has promised the other a happy ending. They're too hardened, too scarred for naive fantasies. But in the silent cockpit, the spark between them is undeniable. With a final look at the dusty moon vanishing below, he guides the ship into the starlit void, heading toward a future shaped by cooperation instead of hatred. The Emperor still looms, a threat that won't vanish easily, but they've found allies, a path forward, and in each other, a reason to fight not just for revenge, but for something more. As they plunge into hyperspace, Syra opens her eyes and meets his gaze. No words pass between them, but in that shared look, they acknowledge what they've become, partners, in every sense that matters. Outside the viewport, stars stretch into infinite streaks of light, and they fly onward, resolute, ready to face whatever darkness awaits. And though either can say what the end will bring, for now, they have each other, and that is enough.